Thanks, Chris.
Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios. It is a beautiful day here in Florida on the 2nd of November, 2021. And we have a tremendous guest today. Mark Wheatley joins us from London. He is a politician in the city of London who used his role there for advocating for Brexit, promoting trade links to the US, and a cause near and dear to my own heart, challenging the communists in China. And presumably communists wherever we find them right now. Their power center is China. Couple of fascinating tidbits before we kick in, and I'm going to welcome Mark to give us some introductory remarks. But for students of American history, Mark is actually a relative of Roosevelt in the way that P.G. O'Rourke said this would be the socialist in the wheelchair, not the good one that shot bears. So that's okay. But as the son of, as he says, a Chilean anarchist and a British Tory. Mark, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you here. How are things?
Hi, Chris. Well, very good, thank you. I mean, I guess in terms of messy times, we're caught between Halloween and bonfire night. So I've got my kids going bananas with the Halloween treats and looking forward to the bonfires that come on the 5th. So yeah, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
That's excellent. Fun fact, I got my hearing damaged Guy Fawkes night in South Africa years ago when someone set a bomb off on a beach that I was part of. So the PAGOD, which was the People Against Gangsterism and Drugs at the time, had a flourishing side business in vigilantism, and they used that in very strange ways, one of which was damaging my hearing. So anyway, I hope you have a more fun bonfire night. So for those Americans especially who don't really know, you know, the city of London, long history, you are part of that political structure. Can you tell us a bit about that and kind of its background, where it is today, what you actually do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the City of London is a funny beast. People often think of Greater London as the London that I'm involved with, and it isn't. I mean, essentially, the city is the Roman city, the square mile, right at the heart of the rest of London, and it was fortified by the Romans way back, you know, nearly 2,000 years, and became really one of the trading entrepôts of the Roman Empire. When the Romans left, it fell into all kinds of disarray, and then it was revived. And what it became was kind of the kernel for the growth of London generally. And citizens in the City of London had freedoms which others kind of didn't really exercise. So when William the Conqueror came over to basically biff and baff the Anglo-Saxons, he got to the walls of London and he realized that suppressing the city would be difficult. So he essentially struck a deal with our forebears to protect the liberties of the merchants and the citizens of London. And that gave us a kind of an interesting, I suppose, series of advantages and things we could work with historically. And it's those that have been really the root of the prosperity of London and our values and our interests. So essentially over years, we've protected those liberties, you know, life, property, that kind of fundament. And we've developed a significant kind of strange and quirky local beast. So we are only a public authority for that square mile. We've got about 9,000 residents. We've got about 500,000 workers, though, and that's really what gives us kind of significance in the moment, because we're the home to the financial services community. And now, frankly, the UK financial services community is about just under 7% of our economy. It's about £132 billion contributor.
And for those foreigners who don't know, who aren't in the capital markets, the square mile is shorthand for financial services in London, much like Wall Street generally is in America.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is. It is a square mile physically, and you know, we have our interests. Conventionally, we represent the wider financial services community wherever it's found in the UK. So that's Canary Wharf and elsewhere. The Lord Mayor of the City of London, when he or she travels abroad, does so as kind of an ambassador for that sector of our economy. But we have other interests. You know, we have our own police force. So it's not the Metropolitan Police that look after our streets. Notionally, the Queen, much as we respect and defer to her as we should as good Brits, notionally she asks permission to enter the square mile. She doesn't sort of just barge in. And we've got some odd quirks. We own 5 bridges across the Thames. And I mean, that's historic. Well, I guess we wanted access to the city. But we've got a fund that supports that called the City Bridge Fund, and it's got a surplus. We give about 20 million a year to charity from the surplus on that, and essentially that, and that's kind of making sure we can maintain those bridges. So we've got kind of a trade role, we've got a political significance, local in terms of authority, but in terms of our influence, the combination of all of this means we have strong links in Westminster and Whitehall into the kind of the national political framework. We have very strong links with the diplomatic community in London and our embassies abroad. We have our own investment portfolio that we've built up over the years, about £5 billion sterling. I mean, I'm not great with numbers, so it's up or down a bit on that. And then we've got these other interests and charitable engagements. So we sit in an odd place in the national fabric. We're very traditional, but we've got a real significance in the moment. Yeah. And I've been involved 9 years now, I think. So
that's fabulous. And I gather that there's some excellent particular freedoms to being a freeman of the City of London. Like you can drive your sheep across Tower Bridge once a year or something. And if you're convicted of a capital crime, you get to be hanged with a silk rope rather than a hemp rope. So, you know, good things.
Yeah. I mean, I'd rather avoid the conviction, but yeah, exactly. If you're going to go, you might as well have silk rather than hemp. And
true.
And the sheep. Well, I mean, that's it's that toll that's built up the I said the fund that supports the bridges. Because if you were a citizen, you didn't need to pay that. I think 1,000 years ago, it was a penny to bring in your sheep or whatever. Right. You didn't need to pay that, but other people did. And that fund is what enabled us to build other bridges. The most recent being it's called the Millennium Bridge, but we call it the Wobbly Bridge. It's kind of a footbridge between the South Bank and St. Paul's. And it's, it's just great to be part of all of that. And much as I admired her, it was a privilege to be part of the corporation team that represented our strong regard for Mrs. Thatcher, for Lady Thatcher. When she died, we hosted her funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral. And, it's things like that, through to our involvement with state banquets, that make me so proud to be part of the corporation in terms of what we can do there and then what we can do commercially and politically.
That's great. Well, I know as a convening body, I've come across the corporation a number of times. I was very fortunate enough that someone made a grave mistake years ago and included me in a dinner the Lord Mayor held at the Queen's residence in New York, which was phenomenal. But in terms of substantive discussions, the ability to convene both public and private sector grandees, and then the odd person they made a mistake about was really powerful and really kind of influential. I actually still deal with a few of the people I met at that dinner to this day. It was like 15 years ago. So I've always been impressed with the ability, and New York doesn't really have anything like it. There isn't a similar sort of governing body that looks after Wall Street as a public service. I mean, in theory, kind of New York does, but so what are the big priorities now? What was in the lead up to Brexit? You saw the vision clearly. You wrote a great preface for Beppe Pizzuli's Law to Brexit, which was delightful, which hopefully will become available to English readers soon. But what were the main things that you saw coming into that vote, and what made you so strongly pro-Brexit in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely adore the corporation, and I really respect my colleagues. And that always sounds like a kind of an ominous preface to something that's going to be the other way. As you say, I mean, I think what we can do really powerfully is exercise influence by getting people together and talking. What we don't always do so well, and it's probably like any group, we reflect who we are and our own predilections and assumptions and our own bias. And my mum, as I think you touched on earlier, my mum was a Chilean anarchist. My dad was a Yorkshire Tory. And I've always been a bit of an odd beast in that I have respect for tradition, I have respect for institutions. But one of the things my mum always informed me about when I was a kid was to be a bit skeptical about institutional thinking. And as Brexit began to come forward, I mean, even right the way through the vote, I had some kind of conflicting views. I wasn't kind of 100% committed. But I think when that conversation first started, I was a mild Eurosceptic. But once the referendum was guaranteed, I wasn't sure quite which way I'd vote. But the more and more I got washed in what I thought was really fanciful, overblown, and kind of basically doom mongering. If Brexit happens, the world will fall apart. Nobody I know who earns, and these are almost direct quotes, nobody I know who earns more than 400,000 pounds is going to vote for Brexit.
Right.
And the more and more people are saying things like that to me, the more I thought, well, I just don't get this. The European Union has had there's been some benefit, particularly for the financial services community from membership of the EU. I really do get that. But the way I saw it was there's this kind of political superstructure that's layering upon all the other good stuff.
Right.
And it was becoming increasingly dirigiste. I mean, you can see it at the moment with what's going on in Poland. You can see it with, actually what's going on in Germany. There's that kind of contention between national constitutional arrangements and this kind of emergent superstructure. And the more and more I looked at the EU, I get the contribution in some measure to security, but frankly, NATO was there. So I thought the EU is grabbing almost the entirety of something that isn't its praise. And a lot of the rest of the stuff that we were sort of lavishing these kind of extravagant sort of views on the EU over were really aspirations. They weren't achievements. It's things the EU might do in due course. And to do those, I thought it's becoming increasingly illiberal. And the more and more I kind of just spoke with people, at the risk of sounding dreadfully pompous, on the Clapham omnibus or elsewhere, I thought their lives aren't being particularly enriched by the EU. There's this little community that's doing very well. I'm from the north of England. And when I went back and spoke to schoolmates, there was increasingly this sense of, well, you in London, you in the city, and you're not part of us. And part of my Brexitiness was really an attempt to arrest that drift and that separation of an elite from the rest of the population. And I'm not talking about anarchists or communists. These are schoolmates who've got their own business.
You're preaching to the choir here. I know that it was fascinating for me, having spent a lot of my life in the UK, speaking with a lot of friends, most of whom work in the city. But what I found so fascinating was that was kind of like being in New York when you knew you were going to vote for Trump because you'd rather gouge your eyeballs out with a spoon than vote for Hillary. But why say it, right? What's the point? Why say it? And so I knew lots of folks in the city, many of whom with rural roots. A good friend of mine comes from a family of farmers about an hour and a half outside the city. And you get him started on Brexit and Brussels and the fact that some micromanaging bureaucrat was telling him how wide his hedgerows had to be. Oh, he lost his mind, right? So bureaucracies, you can guarantee they will always overreach, right? There's not a bureaucrat in the world that will look at all of the rules promulgated and all of the policies being implemented and said, whew, that's great. We're done. We've issued every rule. We've made every mandate we can. Oh, time for a nap. They don't do that, and they should, because if you're smart enough to get a bureaucratic sinecure in a department that had nothing more to do, you could sit around and drink and play whist for your entire career and retire handsomely, and the population would thank you for it.
Yes.
But instead they overreached and they irritated a lot of people they didn't need to irritate. The sparrow ratio to kite ratio in Northumberland has nothing to do with Brussels bureaucrats, and they refuse to admit that.
Exactly, because there's this kind of, this is only a half-baked notion, but maybe in a world in which we're less faithful in a religious sense, the state kind of represents a lot of our kind of base in those terms, and people feel that they're fulfilling a higher duty. I look at it, much as I quite like a lot that Boris does. I look at a conversation in UK conservative circles, which is that people who call themselves one nation conservatives and who feel that they've inherited the mantle of Disraeli, and people like Disraeli really want to. And it's a classic thing. A good politician wants to do good with somebody else's money. A bureaucrat wants to enforce good outcomes with somebody else's authority, and that's just, by and large, they just screw up people's lives. And the world would be better.
That would be the definition of a bureaucrat. Hi, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you.
Yeah, exactly. But when people like me sort of advance a different notion, there's that whole presumption that somehow we begin from an evil point because we want to sort of qualify or restrict the state. I don't. I think people will do a lot better. There is a need for a state. I don't share my mother's anarchism right the way through. We do need an armed force. We do need a police force.
Someone's got to pick up the trash. Like, that was the major error that the West made in Algeria when the French finally left in the 80s and they had elections and they elected the Islamist party. And the stupidest thing the West ever did, I would argue, broadly speaking, was to disallow that election. Biggest mistake ever. If you're a romantic figure with a Quran and a Kalashnikov in the hills, pointing to the fact that the West doesn't really like democracy, they like their elected officials, you should have made those guys pick up the trash on time. They would rapidly have stopped being romantic figures, and they would have been just the guy that's not getting it done.
Because it's not easy to deliver services. And again, that overreach you talked about previously, it's not just what they want to try and enforce in regulatory terms, but the state doesn't deliver massively well. Okay, there are some things only a state can do, but when it goes beyond its core services, and absolutely, I mean, some of the stuff going on in the States at the moment, kind of defunding a whole police department does worry me. But essentially, people should just get on with what they can do effectively, and then do it, not turn a blind eye to gangsters.
To a fascinating dynamic here. It's insane. I mean, I don't know how quickly, actually, the people, I have great faith in kind of everybody, right? Like, not in sort of some romantic thing where a politician occasionally refers to the common man, which usually means somebody he doesn't respect, but he wants his vote. Madness. I've done business all over this country, and I've got friends who are, just recently in Dallas, and the guy tried to, Florida, he tried to go to his favorite watch store, which he hasn't been to in 2 years because of all this Wuhan nonsense. And when he gets there, we in Florida dress in flip-flops and shorts all the time, right? It takes a while. Not a really formal bunch because it's really hot here. They wouldn't let him in the store because he looked, first off, he was wearing like polo shirt and shorts, and crime has gotten so dangerous in Dallas. This is in Texas. We're not even talking about Portland, where they defunded the police, where they're now, you can only go to things like high-end jewelry stores by calling and making an appointment. And if they don't know you, they might not make the appointment in the first place. Like, all of that day-to-day insanity, which the American media refuses to cover, just refuses to cover, because that clashes with their fantasy of the Biden unity government. Well, I call them the Biden unity government because Biden is unifying people in their hatred of this moron. But the country's decaying because of incremental steps like that. And here in the last free state in America, Florida, everything's just fine. Things work normally. And it's working normally because the national media screams about how awful we are and how evil DeSantis is. Because they're stirred up to do so. But I mean, again, it goes right back to that early stuff. I think the city of London prospered because people felt safe here. Right. And if people fundamentally feel safe on their streets, then you've got a whole world of problems coming at you. And I don't know how you solve them, because once, Guildhall, which is the centre of city government, I mean, that was a ruin for about 300 years. There was grass growing in our yard before King Alfred and others rebuilt our fortunes. But it's really, civilization can hang on a thread, and yet we've got so many blessings. We've got so much. And it's kind of implicit in your title, but these are messy times. They've been messy right through history, but all you need is a bit of resolution and a bit of effectiveness and a bit of kind of chutzpah to get on with them. And I just don't know quite why we don't see that. No, it's fascinating because you're in the thick of it constantly as a politician. You have to be persuading people. Now, your natural constituency in the square mile arguably is kind of rational and with you in terms of they need to think about these issues constantly because it often impacts how we make a living. And so slightly switching gears, I've been because I've been involved so heavily in Greenland mining for so long, I've got a direct experience of dealing with the Chinese communists, and they're absolutely awful. And in terms of how they approach the world, I think my knees are not broken only because I'm an American and I'm not visiting mainland China ever, right? If I were a Congolese and I were arguing about a mine in Congo, I'd probably disappear. But luckily, I'm an American living in America, trying to support a Greenland mine. And so, seeing how their kind of brass knuckle approach to mercantilist policies has gone on. What if anything are the direct effects you've seen in terms of the city and how you've had to accommodate or fight back against that influence?
Yeah, I mean, my push on this has really been just over a year. I mean, I've long had concerns. So when the Tiananmen Square sort of protests were suppressed, I was a student. I ran some activities then. I had the great pleasure of standing on a stage with Alex Salmond, the former leader of the Scottish National Party.
That's great.
A wonderful bull though he is. I don't share his other views, but yeah, I did engage then, and I've done a bit over time. But really, it was as the PRC government was bringing in the national security law on Hong Kong. I felt a bit concerned about how that was going to play out. I wasn't sure quite what the City of London locus would be, but I spoke with a very good friend and a good colleague of mine who's I'm an idealist. I'm not an intellectual, and I'm not kind of very practical. But one of my colleagues is a guy called Andy Mayer, and Andy is all of those things. He's practical and he's deeply intelligent. So I spoke with Andy and asked him, what could we do to express some concern about this? And he drafted a motion, and essentially that motion was pretty mild and moderate. And what it said was, if any Hong Kong residents, and particularly any who hold British passports, feel uncomfortable about the national security law and the suppression of liberty in Hong Kong, we in the City of London will welcome them. They're our sister city after all.
Right.
And I thought, well, okay, that might ruffle a few feathers, but it's pretty, it's difficult to challenge that. Well, I didn't really reckon on how that would be received with the Chinese embassy. So we were asked to reconsider putting that motion. There was a little dance around the timings of it, which meant that we put it in September last year. I don't believe it was expected to pass, but it did, because frankly, it's not easy to argue for repression. The Chinese embassy went completely bananas verbally on it afterwards.
Right.
And I'm paraphrasing. I mean, I read the press release a couple of times, but it's probably on the net if you want to look sort of September 2020. But they basically called the Corporation of London childish. They told us to come to our senses, to understand how significant they are to us. And all of that I did get. When I moved the motion, I was a bit concerned because there's a lot of renminbi trading that happens in London.
Sure.
They are partners on green finance bonds and clean tech initiatives. And I get that. But to some extent, we've got this policy framework. Forgive me, most of your viewers will understand ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So
right.
Environmental, exactly what it says on the tin, it's the planet. Social is human rights and labor practices, and governance is kind of intellectual property and board matters. And yet they were yoked together by the United Nations nearly 20 years ago. We as a corporation signed up to the United Nations PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, a few years ago. So we're kind of committed to this, but we've long been supporters of ESG generally. And I think globally about a third of investments are under an ESG framework now. And we want the City of London to be kind of an exemplar. So where am I going with that? But I mean, I think the human rights bit of that gives us some locus on Hong Kong anyway. But I was a little concerned about how it would play out in interest terms. I don't think it's been particularly damaging, although the Chinese embassy went really over the top after the vote happened.
Of course, well, they're playing to their domestic audience that needs to defend the pride of the Middle Kingdom against the foreigners. Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this year we decided to sort of go a little bit further and kind of tweak the tail of the wolf, I suppose, as President Xi would call himself, a little bit more. So with the treatment of the Uyghurs, I felt, as they've really ratcheted down on those poor people, wretched
millions
people.
of imprisoned Muslims, beards shorn off, demanding they absorb Marxist atheist principles, and the predominantly, well, certainly the American Democrat Party and 90% of our media just sit there and go la 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 la. They don't want to hear about it because they like their cheap cell phones.
No, exactly. Well, it's nearly as you say, it's nearly 2 million people locked up in slave labor camps, essentially. And that treatment kind of gets me a bit concerned, especially given our ESG framing. But then at the same time,
it might violate one of those, maybe the S and the G.
just possibly modern slavery. It's potentially a bit questionable. So
we should convene a panel. We need a working group to think about that, to see whether locking millions of people up there for their religion violates social or governance. But anyway, we'll get to that.
But no, you jest. I mean, that's actually one of the lines, and there are a few. You know, one is we condemn human rights abuses wherever they are in the world, but it would be invidious to name individuals. Well, you know why that is. And another is we've got clear standards on the environmental. Let's shape some consensual and agreeable standards. Well, if the People's Republic of China under President Xi agrees that the treatment of the Uyghurs is slavery, I'll eat my hat. I mean, it is, but they're not going to commit to that. So we don't need to flap around trying to get everybody to subscribe to a nonsense. We've got to take some action. But the reason, the other instigation was, over the last year or so, we've been debating the city's historic links to slavery. And in many ways, we've been looking at that because we used to get rich on slavery in the Caribbean, essentially. And it was pretty deplorable stuff. But at the Common Council meeting, which is the council meeting of the corporation back in October, we had a big statement on that, really clear about how much we condemned historic slavery. And I just thought, well, that's the moment we've got to push the fact that,
there's modern slavery. Why don't we condemn that too? We can actually do something about that.
Exactly.
History.
Well, exactly. What we condemn in the past, let's condemn in the present. Now, I've got to say, I didn't really carry the whole council. We had essentially, it's a bit more complicated than the motion fell. It got amended out of all shape, essentially. But yeah, we had a 23-53 vote on that, with a lot of members sitting on their hats. And I think essentially they sat on their hands because they felt really uncomfortable. They've been told jobs are at stake in the City of London. They've been told our financial interests require essentially turning a blind eye to this. And they don't feel comfortable really going either way on an emotion like that. But I think ultimately we are going to be put in the spotlight just as much. Yeah, the matters that happened 200 years ago, we've got to face right now. And anyway, the Chinese government, if we talk about the classic political sort of separation of values and interests, what is going on from the PRC it's totally against our value space, the value space that has got us prosperous.
Right.
And it's not even good for our national interests. I'm not actually sure it's good for our financial services interests, because you might know.
Not. I was running a futures commission merchant in London, in the city, during a time when there was a Chinese trading house where the guy who had been around forever, it was beyond Orwellian. It was insanity. He managed to rack up losses of around £2 billion on futures contracts in metal trading. And then when the exchange tried to call the money in from the Chinese trading house, the offices disappeared. The guy, the trader, disappeared. It wasn't like he's been fired. They just disavowed the fact that he ever existed. And the official Chinese government line was, well, if you've been allowing yourself to be duped by a fraudster, that's not our problem. We have no idea who this person is. It was insanity. They tried to walk away from $2 billion in losses, which were gains for someone else, by claiming he just didn't exist. It was one of the worst things I've ever seen.
Well, absolutely. And that goes right to the heart of things, because I know we can get misty-eyed about my word is my bond and all of that stuff, but it had some value. And I was a very good friend. She's academic. She's really connected to the Chinese embassy. She spent a number of years in the States and then arrived in the UK 3 years ago. Invited me to listen to Jean-Pierre Raffarin, the former French Prime Minister, talk to kind of a select British audience just before COVID. And what she was trying to do was a bit of gentle re-education with me, because Raffarin is a strong Sinophile in terms of a strong President Xi file, essentially. Right. And he basically said, you sentimental Anglo-Saxons have got to get over your attachment to these funny values. And he highlighted contract. He said, because let's face facts. And I do get where he's coming from in part. He said, contract is a reflection of a balance of power between two partners at a particular moment in time struck on paper. And he said, when you deal with the Chinese government and business, it's not going to be dependable, because as the balance of power changes, they will renegotiate and they will slip out.
Absolutely. Their signature on a piece of paper is meaningless.
Yeah, exactly. And I took that back when we were pressing the Hong Kong motion, when people were gently trying to twist my arm. And one very eminent former Lord Mayor, who I won't name for obvious reasons, sort of said to me, well, yeah, let's face facts. They're right. Contract doesn't really matter that much. whilst understanding the kind of the point he's trying to make in one respect, I think that's very dangerous for people in the City of London to concede either privately or publicly, because those are the values that got our market to be prosperous. Because
the
it
only
goes,
way a market can work. If people suddenly decide,
exactly.
When the trade goes against me, I'm not going to pay. Everything grinds to a halt because you have no faithfulness that the market can work, that you can buy or sell and believe you're going to get what you bought or sold. Oh, absolutely. It's horrifying.
And when ultimately, however you dress it up, the counterpart is the Chinese government with
Always.
All of it great, you're going to have real problems. And I talk about the significance of the City of London, but we're kind of like this gnat when we're dealing with that. But there are operations in the UK and elsewhere, the United Front, the Confucius Institutes, that have got great depth of support. And these operations essentially spin and promote, particularly President Xi's version of the CCP and of the People's Republic of China. And I don't think the UK, wider public, or indeed the UK intelligentsia or our commercial circles or our political circles, are really properly awake to that activity yet.
They are paying no attention at all. And usually, and I give them huge credit, a lot of like the Confucius Institutes, a lot of them are dressed up in excellent cultural trappings from a cultural perspective. Deep, rich history, brilliant, beautiful stuff. Thank you for gunpowder, good stuff. And a lot of all of that history is very worth transmitting, and that's all phenomenal. I mean, two good friends of mine grew up in Beijing, and they, I'll be careful here since they live in China. One of them especially, he was a child of academics. They were teachers and professors at Beijing University during Mao. And they were sent off to the May 4th farms to, get themselves educated in the ways of the peasantry. How dare you be an uppity intellectual, all this great stuff. Well, one of the beautiful parts about communism is their capacity to mismanage is bottomless. And so during the tragedies of the millions of people that starved to death, they were all in the cities. So the intellectuals who were sent out to the May 4th farms, well, it was a bummer because you went from being a professor of literature to being a farmer, but you ate and you didn't die.
Yes.
So, it's been fascinating to hear him and other people like him who are, what's that great line? Was it Twain? And patriotism is loving your country always and your government sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So from his standpoint, he's proud to be Chinese. His family is still there. He hasn't left. His thoughts on the Chinese Communist Party are a different issue. And you just got to wonder, is there a path forward for the country where another good friend who lived there said everyone wonders in the West why they squashed down on Falun Gong so badly. And the answer, of course, is that every time a Chinese government's been overthrown, it started as a spiritual movement in the rural provinces. So they don't see people who are humming quietly, peacefully. They see an overthrow of the Communist Party in Falun Gong.
Yeah, and they've got that fear about kind of the balance of the centrifugal and the centripetal forces and anarchy, but not my mum's kind of fuzzy poetic anarchy, but real
crazy, violent anarchy, everyone for themselves, people dying in the streets, murdering for bread. Yeah, not fun stuff. You need a government.
No, and it really has happened. I do get that. I mean, there are two Chinese thinkers, and I don't know either of them, but one, Chai Zia, and Chai Zia, I think, is living in the States now because she was an intellectual and an academic, and she was promoting a more liberal version of kind of how the CCP could go forward.
Sure. And post-Mao, a lot of them flourished in China. There was room for a lot of that discussion.
Yeah, exactly. And then there is a guy, and you'll be familiar with him, but I think Wang Henneng, he was in that kind of broad, with the small L kind of liberal movement. But again, it goes right back to us, I suppose. He came over went over to the States, I think, for a year in the 80s. And he went back basically convinced that we've lost our way. And therefore what previously attracted him appalled him. And he's gone back with his whole.
He's not alone in that.
No, exactly. That's where I think he's got a point, because if what I think we have is really just a crisis of confidence. It's emotional. We're almost living in paradise and thinking we live in hell, and we're not facing the issues at the moment with a bit of confidence. attending to it kind of intellectually, but practically at the same time. We're running around flapping its guilt, its grievance, and to some extent, even back in the 80s, that whole kind of giddiness was probably the first symptom of an irrationality. I've always thought the Enlightenment wasn't necessarily quite delivering on its promise, but
considering the flakes who underpinned it, it was hard to see it was going to be a successful social program.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, particularly the French guys there. But but where I think we've got an issue is, some of the values I kind of get misty-eyed about. The liberal values, essentially, to some degree, and some of them are products of the Enlightenment. Some of them were kind of the things that produced
that would be the British large L liberal, not the American flaky whiny victim.
Oh yeah. No,
be clear for our listeners. We've got the right liberal here.
No, trust me.
Not the whiny woke brats.
No, I might be very distantly related to FDR, but I kind of nod off his worldviews.
Look, even the socialist in a wheelchair thought that public sector unions shouldn't be allowed. So I give credit where credit is due. He made a lot of big mistakes, but at least he had that right. But anyway.
Yeah, exactly. He did some good stuff. But where I think we have to bear in mind, Chinese thought might rest. Those values have not necessarily ever been proven in China.
Right.
Or not successfully over a long period of time. And there is that fear that things could go really out of control. And then they look at us and they think, well, what are those values demonstrating for the West? Because look, they're quite messed up. And they must think we're stupid in how we engage, looking at our strategic positions geopolitically, are kind of the cornerstones of our economy and our value space. I mean, I might not have this precise, but Manchester University was one of the leading places for graphene technology. And do take this one with a pinch of salt. I didn't reread this news article, but we invited over a bright young Chinese student to sort of to work on some cutting edge and really sensitive activities. He went back to China. It turns out he was right the way through. He was a lieutenant in the Chinese forces.
He took all the intellectual property, gone. Yep, absolutely.
And I mean, when we behave without intelligence, we can't command respect. And I think that bit of Wang Hening's analysis, we've really got to recognize has some truth. And then we've just got to get, I think, a little bit more kind of focused, if that makes sense.
Well, it's also because I do a huge amount of work in cybersecurity and national defense over the years, and and some of it's just so obvious it hurts, right? As relayed to me by a retired admiral who had dealt with his Chinese counterparts a lot prior to Xi coming in. So Xi really changed the world in terms of historically he has decided that I'm going to be the first guy ever who is going to successfully control a population by ratcheting down the screws harder. I don't know why, right? Well, again, it's not my problem; it's his problem, and the Chinese. And actually, it's all our problems. But that admiral I spoke to, he conveyed that speaking to his counterpart's thought was, you all moan and cry that we steal your intellectual property. If you don't want us to have it, why is it available on the internet? Right. Yeah. So irrespective of the fact that it's on a network so that people with passwords and authorization, to his mind, rationally enough, if you've got enough brute force computer power, there is no such thing as password protection. There is no cybersecurity. So if you don't want your valuable IP, like missile systems diagrams, to be stolen, why don't you, I don't know, not connected to the internet? And it was such a clear and obvious statement. His point of view was, you must not be serious about protecting this if my lieutenant could sit in a cubicle in Beijing from 9 to 5 and steal it, right? I used to give a lot of talks on cybersecurity and cyber insurance, and I always opened up with, who can tell me what the most important part about stealing trade secrets during the Mission Impossible series, the fun ones where they smoke cigarettes and wore bell bottoms, not the Scientology remake, right? And the whole point was you had to physically break into a place to get to the computer, right? Once you made it easy to access from anywhere, including from countries where it's computer crime is not a crime, right? So you've got Americans who are playing defense constantly and Europeans who are playing cyber defense constantly. The simplest answer is air gap your important data. Don't put it on the internet.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
inconvenient,
So
sure, it's
that,
inconvenient, but they can't steal it without breaking into your headquarters. And
no,
how
no,
we've managed to completely still miss this hurts my head.
I know. I mean, the ineptitude of the West is just writ large, and I don't know why people don't think more deeply about those sort of things. And then there are bright people here.
There are
It's not,
plenty who do, but again, this is the weakness of democracy, right? Unfortunately, 7 idiots can rule 6 wise people. And when it, I ask people constantly, what do you think of the OPM breach? Americans. These are all people from all walks of life, right? 99% of people I ask that look at me blankly. And when I tell them the OPM breach was a greater danger to national security than Pearl Harbor was, they look at me totally blankly. The Chinese or the Russians or whoever it was stole complete records on everybody who ever applied for a national security clearance of any kind. Millions of people in America. Data's gone. And 99% of Americans don't even know it happened. And when you tell them, they gotta go, oh. And that's the danger of intellectual property theft. It doesn't have the drama of a building collapsing, which sears itself into your memory. It's abstract. And so no one pays any attention.
But again, that's another feature of our age. We kind of have that hyper emotional quality, but also we need that kind of dramatic visual thing for things to register. I mean, what I feel, I hope this isn't just an excessive gloom, but when I talk with people about the Uyghurs and stuff like that, it registers for about 30 seconds. And then they go and grab their Starbucks coffee and they're on the device and they're seeing whatever Boris has said. They don't care very deeply. Unless it really shocks them, unless something kind of hits that kind of public consciousness. And our threats aren't always apparent in that sense, but they really are things we've got to face. But we have the resources to do so. I mean, we are still, if you put the Anglosphere together, if you put other Western democracies, or indeed regional ones, India and Singapore, if you call Singapore a democracy, but there are people.
It's a very neat, orderly democracy in which you're allowed to vote in certain ways.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I've got to be a bit careful because the franchise in the city is a little bit interesting. But much as I value my
Singapore is a sterling success. In my mind, they managed to balance public order with incredible economic growth. You give up a few personal freedoms. Yeah, do I really need to chew gum in public? I mean, that was the former leader's big bugaboo, right? He cared about that deeply. But I wonder, is there a way to rally around, and logically defeat an enemy that operates in ways that most people don't see? They don't see the direct impacts of their lives. It's very difficult to rally support for an abstract geopolitical fight that one side has got all the patience and time in the world, and the other side doesn't even know what's happening.
Well, there are two things I would say. Just beginning with the kind of the Chinese side, and there are 3 sets of people I want to kind of raise a flag for right now. Hong Kong Watch these are all UK based. Ben Rogers and his team are doing wonderful work in kind of research, identifying what's going on and bringing it to public consciousness, not just about Hong Kong, but more widely.
Sure.
Baroness Morrissey, and Helena Morrissey used to run a fund management business over here, but she's now the chair of the NEDs at the Foreign Office. She's a very vigorous challenger of the kind of the PRC activities over here. And then thirdly, he's a bit kind of lower profile, but there's a guy called Sam Olson who has a weekly blog called What China Wants. And Sam is a moderate, he's a measured commentator. He does a lot of analysis and he puts out pieces every week or so on the internet. So what China Wants, Sam Olson, I'd strongly recommend. So I think, first of all, we've got to kind of identify what's going on, and it's people like that help do that. Then I think, and I'm part of a little group that's coming together. We haven't yet launched, but we will be doing this month. And what we're going to try and do is partially shine a light on the Confucius Institute, shine a light on the United Front activities in the UK, but also demonstrate how those are prejudicial to our interest. Now, we are not going to be, I'm really mindful of this, we're not going to be grabbing the the headlines on the BBC News. We're not going to get there very quickly.
Sadly.
But what we can kind of just
now with your
nudge
appearance
the-
in Messy Times, it's going to skyrocket right to the top of popular attention.
Well, I hope
so you're
so.
welcome. Let this be your coming out party.
Well, I'd be delighted if it's like Britain's Got kind of anti-POC talent or the X Factor, but I don't think we're going to get quite there. But what we've just got to do is kind of be patient, as you say. We're up against a really powerful adversary, but in terms of advantage, the two things about China that I'd mentioned. One is, when anyone calls himself president for life, in some sense that sounds like a big bold statement, but there's an element of Wizard of Oz about it. If you're really safe, why do you need to have the title?
Right.
There's an element of insecurity in grabbing and promoting that, and a lot of President Xi's stuff. I know he's got resources behind it, but he still doesn't dominate the West militarily or economically.
Ryan, hard to get there.
No, he's moving fast.
He's moving hard to get there.
Yeah, okay, exactly. He is moving fast. I think that's why this is perhaps an unstable moment, because he might do something rash with Taiwan. But he's not there yet. He's still kind of a notch down. And also, they have an aging population. We do in Europe, I get that. But there are issues demographically in China. And then that kind of balance of centrifugal and centripetal forces. The more he slams in a state, the more he has a kind of an anti-corruption drive that's partial. It doesn't affect his people, but does affect others in the party. The more he kind of just chips away a little at his base, and he will look, it's like any dictator, it's like any tyrant, it's like any regime. That one will look really strong until it suddenly doesn't look really strong. Yeah, exactly.
That's what I found so disheartening about Xi from the beginning, right? Again, he comes from his own place. He's one of the first leaders that has not been eschews international travel, doesn't bother to speak any of the languages. Like he's got a strong vision of his country being returned to its preeminent place in the universe, right? That's his vision. But what hurts my head so badly, not just him, but so many people like him, whether in the West and elsewhere, or like, wouldn't you rather be the beloved figure who retires after a while and gets rich on speaking tours in a free society, rather than literally worrying about how many people want to shoot you on a daily basis? Like, I don't understand the attraction, right? He inherited a country that was growing at 10 to 12% per year, although we always talk about the Chinese statistics, and let's roll the random number generator, right? What sounds good. But there was no doubt there was growth happening. And it has been proven that centrally planned economies always do more poorly, as they're seeing now, right? The zombie bank phenomenon in Japan that went on for 20 is still continuing now. The problem they're having with commercial loans that have gone bad in China, they can't admit, right? So you're already living the experiences of the downside to central planning. Wouldn't you at that point in time like take a deep breather, get out a book of Milton Friedman, translate it into Mandarin, and relax a little bit? Like, it would seem to be the best period in time to have become the leader of China. And instead, he went back on this Black Mirror Orwellian social, credit system. And I'm going to watch everybody do everything all the time. Who could care? That's what I found so baffling. Like, you were given the keys to a joyous kingdom, and all you do is now the world is focused on you, a repressive maniac. They're worried about the Uyghurs. You've got people fighting your mercantilist interests. Every Chinese company I deal with personally, great, hardworking folks, fantastic, right? But like, why choose this insane path? And maybe we'll never know. But it gives me hope. I guess it gives me hope that as you point out to, authoritarian regimes are an iron fist until the fist shatters, right? Hopefully it shatters smoothly without huge amounts of tumult, and the country continues to grow with a better path. I mean, it's a naive hope perhaps, but I don't know.
That as much as anything else is my fear. I mean, there is a book, again, I should have kind of looked it up before we talk, but I think it's called Autumn Leaves. It's a big, hefty kind of narrative history that I read a few years ago. And it's really about the Taiping rebellion, although it says it wasn't really a rebellion. Again, your point, religious root to that, and then how it's sort of washed blood. people that I know who are mainland Chinese as well as others. I mentioned that academic who came over from the States. They are, as you say, they're universally lovely people, and they're bright, hardworking, industrious, intelligent. There's kind of a lot of stuff there to like on an individual basis. I don't want to see people like them live through chaos and bloodshed. But it's that overreach of any government, complicated by this kind of insecure desire to do everything so quickly, so authoritatively. When it is local politics, but when we started earlier, what makes the city great isn't our direct authority, it's our influence.
Right.
And why don't more politicians just want to be influential figures rather than kind of achieve an office? And then, well, what's that all about? What's your purpose in office? I mean, Xi's purpose seems to be the recreation of the grand middle kingdom, as you say. I mean, that kind of I get, but if it depends on an apparatus of authority,
but he's doing so and clearly with a vision that doing so is a zero-sum game. For you to win, you have to lose, and that doesn't. Well, the entire history of economic development and capitalism shows that's not true. Right? You grow the pie and everybody wins. He's got a very zero-sum game vision of the world, which is detrimental ultimately, not just to kind of the market, but to the Chinese themselves.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a mercantilist approach. I mean, it's that kind of, the cake is there and we're going to carve it up. And it's, well, I suppose that's the thing. I mean, governments aren't enterprising. If we were, maybe there's an argument for drafting in Bill Gates. Steve Jobs is too long gone, I guess. But
but to be fair, one of the things, no system is perfect, and no system is perfect, right? And so one of the things I've been heavily involved with for years is this whole critical minerals, rare earths supply chain. I had the delight of being in the White House a few days before Trump offered to buy Greenland, explaining the importance of our rare earth mining Greenland. So I get the credit for that. But what the Chinese have done right, for example, I'm not going to name names. People can go research this on their own, but comparable to what we are doing in rare earth mining and trading, an American, and I'm not going to name names, an American who I know very well, spent 7 years or so trolling around America, asking people to invest in building big battery factories, right? He thought this was coming. So it wasn't Elon, right? But this is before this. This is in the 90s or 2000s. He couldn't get anyone, right? And this guy wasn't like a 23-year-old kid with an idea. His name is on dozens of patents in this space. He knows this space, right? It's like Bono and Paul McCartney showing up to record executives saying, I've got an idea for a concept album, right? You fund it. But he got no interest because the amounts of money were huge. It was in the billions of dollars, right? And everyone, too many Americans, certainly business school students, did their MBA studying supply chains, and it's better to do things more efficiently overseas. No one invested. Very frustrating, right? He really thought this was a competitive advantage. We needed to just begin to focus on building battery factories here in America again. Nope, no one wanted to do it. He got a call in the middle of the night, as he relates, on his cell phone from a guy in China who said, hi, I've read all of your confidential materials. Of course he has, right? They've hacked his system. If you don't want it to be available, why did you send it over email, right? So they've got everything, all of his plans. And he said, I will build what you want, but you have to build it here. And the American said, how much money is available? And he said, unlimited.
Yeah. That
company now controls 60% of the battery market in the world. It was founded less than 10 years ago, right? And I know them, they're great people, they're hardworking, they're focused on what they do. But the problem in the West was, with all this capital sitting in pension funds and endowments and all these places that all have these like weird restrictions. Well, I can't invest in something unless it's been invested in by someone else. And I can't put money in unless it's 30% or less. Like, all these insane restrictions meant that this guy wanted to build the industry of the future, and now the Chinese own it. And I give the credit to the Chinese for that. That's not our fault. They did the right thing. We did the wrong thing. And we're about to repeat it in other industries. I'm seeing the exact same thing happen right now. At least when it comes down to it, they write the check.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I touched on David Epstein earlier, but I mean, it's kind of a popular book. It's out there. And what I'm about to quote from Epstein is a kind of a theme that's been around for longer. But in the book, and he's got some lovely little kind of anecdotes and vignettes, he talks about the distinction between hedgehogs and foxes, and the hedgehogs being the tight, linear technocrats and the foxes ranging widely. And what I think, what I certainly see in political circles is that kind of siloing and narrow base of political party, its loyalty, its ambition, its ability, but its loyalty first and foremost. Don't rock the boat. It's there in business when you're looking at these kind of slightly risky, edgy ideas, lots of strategic potential, but it's a bit easier to go with that decision. And I think we make a lot of bad decisions because we've kind of, or rather we avoid making decisions, which then other people make, because we're kind of, it's our whole approach to risk. We've gone from being giddy about risk maybe 3 or 4 decades ago to being kind of completely obsessed with how things are going to go wrong. And it's evident with COVID, our approach to
craziness.
Bananas.
First time in history we ground entire economies to the halt because someone over 85 who smoked his or her whole life might get a virus and die. It's madness. It's madness.
Yeah.
It's been madness from day one.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think there are things we can do to mitigate now. Now I've been double jabbed. I've got no problem with that. But I'm not having. Well, I don't want my daughter to be jabbed because I think the risk reward is not in favor.
The risk to children is infinitesimal. Statistically, in the United States, it is more dangerous for a child to ride in a car on a highway with their parents than it is to get the virus.
Exactly. But then, that, as you say, that whole closing down of the economy. I mean, we're only a local authority, so it wasn't a City of London conversation. I tend to, my bias is I tend to think everything revolves around the City of London and everything revolves around my ward, which isn't the case. I get that. But when we were getting, I know, I can but hope. But, when we were getting public policy briefings, oh gosh, months and months ago, I can't even remember this one, but I did ask, because we're in a slice of London, about an eighth of London. I did ask whether the focus on COVID infections meant delayed consultations and delayed sort of treatments for other issues, cancer. It's that stuff that's come out.
How dare you ask that question?
Oh no, but well, exactly. But I mean, to be fair, the official gave me an answer, which was they didn't believe there'd been any delays. And I just sort of said, well, that seems a bit surprising. And then I was assured that, they would check and get back to me. This was kind of early in that kind of conversation. Of course, I never got the information. I'm sure it was said in good faith, but then kind of in a public forum, the question is just kind of sat on. And then later we're told we've got to follow the data. Well, what data? I mean, there are people's businesses failing. What does that lead to in terms of suicide? There are people not getting cancer treatments. But it's a bit like your point on the data penetration. It's not as obvious. The suicide that happens 3 years down the line. The kid.
The alcoholism is creeping up slowly, and it's bolstering the local pub.
Exactly. All right. It's not even bolstering the pub. It's bolstering the home delivery supermarket that's sending this poor guy, the bubble wrap vodka and beer. And it's all of that stuff that it's a bit less obvious than the pandemic. It grabs attention. And given that we're already halfway scared about the environment, about technology change, about financial positions, precariat, all of that, people just need that little tip to kind of hysteria, and it's a difficult thing to bring them back.
Oh, it's turned out to be impossible. We're not going to cover more of it because I know, and this is hilarious. We had a colleague of mine in New York I've worked with forever, also in the markets, much more sort of bought the New York line about mask mandates and all that. Fine, right? So we had a debate about it. Racked up, I think, 40 views in 2 hours, and it was an hour and a half discussion. Right, so in the middle of the night, I woke up to an email from YouTube telling me that I'd won the equivalent of a woke Pulitzer, that they had pulled it down because I was accused of spreading medical misinformation. And when I asked what medical misinformation, they came back with some bland nonsense about anything that contradicted local health authorities and the World Health Organization advice, which was really funny because, as I wrote back, well, here in Florida, my state local health authority agrees with me that masks shouldn't be mandated. So what you're telling me is the Chinese Communist Party owned who is your standard of care in terms of Orwellian, right? Clearly, it's a 23-year-old kid in a cubicle in Cupertino who doesn't care and heard mask and his boss told him to delete it. But it's insanity. So we're not going to talk about more about that here because we'll be pulled.
but that kind of loops us back to Brexit where we began, because my wife is Czech, and I'm the only person in my family. My daughter, my wife, all the Czech side and almost actually all the British side think I was completely bonkers in voting for Brexit. My daughter is now in the house. She might well intrude at this moment with kind of a grumpiness about her. But basically, my Czech mother-in-law had to concede that Brexit meant that we got our vaccination procurement better handled than the EU did, because we were freer to act. Now, I mean, whichever way you go, I mean, I touched on being double jabbed, but it's that kind of freedom and that liveliness that occasionally you can see, and that gives me some hope, because I think it goes right back to the other stuff. Well, the stuff that that person in Cupertino tries to suppress, which is free speech, protection of contract, protection of life. All of those things ultimately give us that kind of herd intelligence. We might be hysterical at the moment, but once we calm down, once we're better led, I mean,
once we delete our Twitter account.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm afraid I've gone to all sorts of trouble with my Twitter account, but broadly speaking,
I got banned because I dared suggest there were two genders, but that's a topic for another day.
Well, again, to have an opinion, why should they, even if it's an opinion that someone else is going to debate, well, what will come out of that debate is a better basis. If people want safe spaces and all of that, frankly, they should stay in a nursery, because we just don't grow unless we're challenged. I mean, you talked about the I think elsewhere about the draft dodging generation, and how that meant they didn't go through a rite of passage.
It's so terrifyingly clear as an anthropologist. Like, there are every society has gates to adulthood, and every single young man that dodged the draft in Vietnam by having daddy pay for a college and education, and oh my Lord, the war's still going on. Well, I guess we're going to get a master's. What do you mean it's still going on? All right, I guess we're going to get a PhD. What we as a country did was create a generation of non-men in a cultural sense. They never took on adult responsibilities. They never faced up to being a man, right? Yeah. I kind of respect those people who said, I'm a conscientious objector, I'm not going, and they did jail time. You're a man. You made a decision, right? But those who hit out on this idiotic idea of a draft deferment because you're getting a PhD in idiot studies, I mean, bafflingly stupid ramifications for this country that never ended. But that sort of path of illogic is kind of what has led us to here, because those people have been indoctrinating 40 years of students in this Marxist brainwashing nonsense, which has led us here.
Yeah, exactly. It's created so many problems because it kind of washes more widely. But my dad's generation, my dad was a glider pilot. He didn't go to university. He got up, he served in the army in the Second World War. And it sounds a bit of a dull job, but glider pilots were pretty brave people because they were dealing with, they didn't have engines and they had people firing bullets at them.
You're going where you're going.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I'm kind of delighted that I had a Pacific upbringing, because my country wasn't at war. And I think I'd have been dead in 2 minutes because I'm this kind of annoying squid who would do something stupid and get shot. But I'm really glad that
I shouldn't look above this parapet. Are you sure? But I want to see what's going on.
Yeah. I'm curious. But frankly, if my nation was in need, I hope I'd have the courage to stand up and do my bit, or as you say, my courage to face time in jail as a
face the consequences either way. And those draft dodgers never faced consequences. They never became adults, and they act like it. They vote like it. And I can't wait till they're all out of office in this country. They're the worst. I can't believe that people in their 70s and 80s are still running chunks of this government. It hurts my brain listening to Janet Yellen warble on about cryptocurrencies and the fact she wants to look at everyone's bank account. It's terrifying. She should be baking cookies for her great-grandchildren. She's had a wonderful career, no problem. But at this point, we need mandatory retirement ages in this country. And if we need a constitutional amendment, so be it.
It's a bit like your President Xi remark. I mean, essentially, there's a time for people to quit. I mean,
exactly. Go relax. You made a lot of money. Chill out. Watch the leaves. Watch the birds. Play with your grandchildren. Really.
But then it creates this kind of distortion. I mean, one of my good friends, and I think the world of him, and he's in cyber actually, but he's ex-special forces over here, Marine. We go running together. A, he's younger than me, and B, he's a lot fitter than me. So he's the one who could do most of the talking. Yeah. Over the years, he's a man who keeps discretion. But of course, when you know someone for a few years, I felt really uncomfortable because I realized a bit more about the stuff he went through in Afghan and Iraq. And then, totally because the city is what it is, as we touched on earlier. We hosted a service for the end of the Afghan operation, I think in 2014. It might have been 2015. I can't quite remember. But because I was one of the few members left around chatting with folks, I got asked to step out onto a balcony, and I thought it'd be to view something. Before I knew it, I was about one of 12 people taking the salute of the UK veterans as they were marching to a reception. And I cannot say how unworthy I felt that day, because I looked at them, some of them limbless, and I thought, what have I done? But nothing that compared to what these guys have done. And then I spoke with them at the end of that reception, and some of their family as well. And it made me realize that these are quite tight communities. There were two mums talking whose sons had been at school together. They died within 3 weeks of each other, 17 years old. Now, I just thought, how kind of, the stuff they're dealing with. And we've got to honor that by having a bit of resolution politically, and by
doing the right thing and building this country in the right way. Absolutely.
Yeah. And yet I don't think we often do, because, going right back to the bubble, the people I walk with don't often meet those people. And there's kind of almost, when Disraeli talked about two nations, and, I think one nation conservatives try to do good through the mechanisms of the state, and they do mean to do good. But a lot of it's actually the currents of emotion and engagement, because the palace isn't safe unless the cottage is safe. Right. But it's a bit about just knowing people and caring about them, and trying to make sure that there aren't obstacles to their success, and that you honor their service when they serve. And I just don't think we in the UK have totally got it right. And I think in the States, something's gone wrong. I mean, I look at Reagan as a hero, but I just wish you had Reagan coming again. I don't know if Nick
deeply wrong, and a lot of it comes down to human beings require a natural amount of tension and stress to develop in the right way, and it has become, broadly speaking, the richest society the world ever saw. There is no other culture, there's no other country that has an entire TV series called My 600-Pound Life, right? Yeah. That should be, if it ever happens, an accident of freak medical problem, right? The fact that you could commit money to building a series with full confidence that there's going to be no shortage of human beings who weigh more than 600 pounds that you can follow around with a camera. That's terrifying.
I know, it's a jab at the hut society, and what's happening to us. We're kind of, as you say, we're one of the richest societies, we are the richest society.
People don't see the frog doesn't feel the water boiling, right? And the hallmarks are there. The great thing I've been watching about our political process the last few years is when people are surprised at what Barry Hussein Soetoro, who latterly called himself Obama, did. I love when people criticize me for saying that. Like, that's what his name was. That's what he called himself. I'm not making anything up. I don't know what you thought. He wasn't lying. He told you what he was going to do. You chose not to listen, right? And Trump, God bless his weird socks, right? He has kind of like Twitter Tourette's, and a lot of his policy instincts were phenomenal, but the man couldn't stop doing insane things like getting into fights with Gold Star parents. But, like, for example, Trump is the first president since, I think, Eisenhower that didn't get us into a new foreign war, and the first one in 5 that when the North Koreans threatened to bomb people, he didn't give them American taxpayer money. He told them he was going to nuke them instead. Now, if I'd had the eloquence of Barry Hussein Soetoro with the policy instincts of Donald Trump, that would have been a great homunculus. We didn't get that. We got what we got. And now we're in this very strange period in history with Biden, who seems to sleep through climate talks, which is probably better than that being actively part of it, frankly. So I'm not criticizing him. But we can go on forever. And as entertaining as it would be for our listeners, we'll have to pick it up again. What are the kind of core things to kind of wrap it up? Your focus on the square mile, more Britain, more writ large after Brexit. What are the key things that you are part of policymaking, pushing for, hope for, in terms of how Britain kind of refreshes its economic and political engagement with the rest of the world after Brexit has happened? What do you see as the hopeful hallmarks, and where do you see the pitfalls?
Well, I mean, it's not kind of in the public kind of eyes very much, but I think one of the ironies post-Brexit is that the Department of International Trade, when it was run by Liz Truss, and particularly animated by Greg Hands, who was the trade policy minister, did a lot of good work about hustling Britain back in commercially, trade deals, roll over some of them, but some of them new. Now, neither of them voted for Brexit. They were both kind of critical, but they've actually done a lot to deliver on our position. Then I think if we're looking at the kind of the Mediterranean, sorry, not the Mediterranean, the Pacific situation, and how the UK is working with Australia and the US to some extent to contain Chinese aggression, I think that's good as well. I think there's a lot of complication there. But if we're looking at trade, and it is the DIT, and both Liz Truss and Greg Hands have moved on from the department, but Liz is now a foreign secretary, thankfully. And if we're looking at kind of security and defense, I think we are beginning to wake up. What I'd like to do is just where I can, that kind of fulcrum in financial services, is get the city a little bit more appreciative that our values and our interests are at stake if we don't defend them and articulate them properly. And on the China debate, that means face a bit of challenge and have the confidence and courage to do so. And apart from that, I think my other challenges are domestic. Just keep the kids happy and
an impossible task. Good training for any politician.
Well, yeah. Exactly, and I'll keep my fingers crossed. I mean, I see there's a close race in Virginia, and of course, the way I'm leaning, I'm hoping it might go to Republican.
I would hope so. It's I appreciate that, and thanks. We'll circle back on more Brexit stuff at a later time. But to close out with that, where my hope is, and I don't know why I still have this hope, because the American political class has done something astonishing to their benefit, to no one else's. They have managed to make the majority of Americans so apathetic that the political class wins by default, right? So, we were, my wife and I, multi-generation native New Yorkers, the night Warren Wilhelm Jr., a communist who gladly supported the Sandinistas and bizarrely renamed himself Bill de Blasio. Still don't know why, don't care actually. The night he won the mayoral election the first time in New York, we sat there staring at the screen and I was like, well, I'm done, I'm out of here. Like, I already live in the most expensive city in America, taxed to the hilt. I'm not thanked for it. No, I'm told in fact I should pay more so his deadbeat constituents can take more of my stuff, so my kids can't have it, right? But he won with 11% or so of the voting eligible adults voting. 89% or something of people didn't bother to vote, and I'm willing to forgive people for 20 years of prosperity under Giuliani and then Bloomberg, but there was no excuse to reelect this clown. Like none. At the end of 4 years, they reelected this idiot. You deserve everything you get. I mean, that is completely, what was it, Mencken that said democracy is the idea that the people are gonna, get what they deserve and get it good and hard. Well, he's destroyed a city that took forever to rebuild from the ashes of the rotten apple. He's destroyed it. And bizarre, absolutely bizarre. And thank God we live in Florida, where Ron DeSantis has done a phenomenal job as governor, which is true because the media hates him. And it's absolutely bizarre. But that hung on a thread. You think of the Virginia race, I hope it goes the right way, because last heard from the guy that DeSantis beat, the Democrat DeSantis beat by like 20,000 votes, is a very narrow margin. He was found high on methamphetamines with a bunch of hookers in a motel in Jacksonville. So that could have been my governor during this viral pandemic. Wow, did we dodge a bullet? Wow. So I hope the people of Virginia don't get McAuliffe back in there, who was a known lunatic.
Oh, yeah, exactly. What was your other candidate wearing a mask, at least, with the hookers and the bags?
You know what? That would be just... I would hope so. That would be pricelessly funny. But the Democrats managed to quietly hustle him out of view, right? But he was a flake, and he would have been, one more screaming liberal idiot, small L American, who would have gone right along with all this insanity. Would have been like California and Michigan and New York with masks for everyone and shut the world down until no one's sick. Thank God he wasn't elected. I mean, really, wow. So I have high hopes the people of Virginia are going to rise up against this nonsense, but we'll see.
There will be a correction at some point. And as you say, I mean, a lot of what Trump did, whether it was influenced by the Heritage Foundation or just kind of innately, was pretty good policy.
Great policy. And the man couldn't shut up. If he had just gotten out of the way, he brought peace to the Middle East. He's got the direct flights between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi. That's awesome.
I know. If only he could have had that likable quality of Reagan, I think he would have gone right back into office and have a different thing. But...
And the tragedy was, for everything he did that was great, he shot himself in the foot a day later for saying insane things and just pointlessly picking fights. And it was his inability to shut up that lost the election. Anyway, we shall see. So Brexit, the world didn't end. Political change can happen. The arc of history is long and swings both ways. Hopefully it doesn't go too far into chaos. But Mark, thank you so much for taking the time with us today. Deeply appreciate it. My listeners have been enlightened by you in a way that they could not have been had I been here alone.
I am sure that's not the case, but it's been a real pleasure being with you, and I look forward to catching up again soon.
Thanks a lot. And for everyone else, until next time, turn off the news. They're lying to you. Tune into Messy Times.